Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our panel discussion. My name is Dr. Felicia Cummings-Smith, and I'm the moderator for this discussion that will be focused on helping families overcome obstacles and how family income plays a critical role in the academic outcomes of students, influencing lifelong health for individuals. My life's work as an educator and now president of the National Center for Families Learning has focused on the links between education and families engagement. And NCFL has been a nonprofit organization that has been in place for 30 plus years, housed here in Kentucky, with the mission to eradicate poverty through education solutions for families. Today, as you can imagine, I'm thrilled to learn as much as I can from our panelists, and this should be a truly inspiring and interesting panel discussion. Our panelists, Brad Hershbein and Ashley Spalding, will share their insights on what's happening at the intersection of education attainment, poverty, and racial wealth gap. It is my pleasure to introduce both of our panelists this afternoon by sharing a brief introduction to both of them. Brad Hershbein is a senior economist and deputy director of research at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. He also serves as the communications advisor to the Institute and as a non-resident fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institute. His research focuses on transition between education and career and how employers hire and compensate their workers. His life work spans higher education access and completion, the long-term effects of the recession on places and employer skill demands, and measuring both employer market power and non-traditional work activities such as contracting and outsourcing. His work has appeared in several leading academic journals and has been covered by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and other national outlets. He earned his BA in economics from Harvard College and his PhD also in economics from the University of Michigan. Before graduate school, he worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Brad will be joining us by video today. And next, our second panelist is Ashley Spalding. I'm proud to introduce Ashley. Ashley is a research director at the Kentucky Center of Economics Policy. She joined the staff in October 2011. Ashley has conducted research on social and economic policies affecting low-income families for over 15 years. Her doctorate and postdoctoral research projects at the University of Florida focused on low-income housing and education, respectively. Ashley holds a PhD in applied anthropology from the University of Florida, an MA in anthropology from the University of South Carolina, and a BA from Stanford University. She was named one of the 2019 Noble Women in Kentucky Politics and Government by the Kentucky Gazette. Ashley is a Kentucky native, and we're proud that she's here with us today. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Brad to share his presentation. Thank you.
Boston Memorial Health Policy Forum. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I hope that you will get some insight and enjoy the presentation. This is based on work that I've actually done with my colleague, Timothy Bardick, and relates to the lifetime earnings of attending college and how that might vary based on the family income circumstances youth have growing up. So I'll get right into it. There's a tremendous volume of research that's been done on how education affects later life outcomes, both at the individual level, but also for society at large. And so at the individual level, there's generally a focus on how education affects earnings, but also health, both physical and mental health, but also mobility in the sense of both intergenerational or economic mobility, intragenerational economic mobility, but also geographic mobility. We know that a lot of college graduates move around. But more recently, there's also been a broader focus on how education can actually have social impacts or social returns. And these sorts of dimensions vary considerably, everything from greater tax revenue, because people pay more taxes when there are more money. There are fewer transfers for the social safety net because people generally, again, have more income. But also there's a public health impact. We've seen a lot of that more recently during the pandemic, where more educated individuals generally had better health outcomes. And of course, civic participation, which yes, includes voting, but also includes things like volunteering. And all of these we generally think are good things that education produces. It's one of the reasons why we collectively publicly fund it. But this doesn't mean that everyone benefits from education equally. In fact, there can be a lot of variable returns, and that's something we need to pay attention to when we're talking about policy. And so some of the ways that research has noticed that the impact of education can vary. It depends on how well educated your parents are. Your own education depends on that, but also how well academically prepared you are coming into, especially for higher education, what neighborhood characteristics you grow up with, and many other factors as well. So this heterogeneity or this variation has a lot of implications for how we think about achieving the goals of higher education, which dimensions it's really going to move different individuals and group society along, as well as how it's going to affect the reduction in inequality, because we generally also think that that would be a goal of education. Despite all this, we think that it matters, but there hasn't been nearly as much attention paid to how the returns to education might vary based on your family income, your socioeconomic status growing up. So this is very surprising. And so it's one of the questions that we really wanted to ask, because there just was really very little on it. And so the question we're asking is, how do the lifetime returns to completing college, at least as captured by earnings? We just mentioned that there are many other factors that we care about besides earnings that are affected by education, but how does it vary depending on your family income growing up when you're a kid? And so just to clarify again, by returns, I'm going to be focused on strictly earnings, even though I know that other things matter. But I'm also focusing on the lifetime returns to education, not a single year, not the differences in earnings for a week's worth of work, but over the lifetime. And that actually adds up quite a bit. And you can kind of see that in this chart, which is showing the lifetime returns to a bachelor's degree versus just a high school diploma right there at the middle of the earnings distribution at the median. So it's 1.46 million for people who get a bachelor's degree at the median, the typical person, versus about $750,000 for someone who only gets a high school diploma. So those are just two education levels, college degree or bachelor's degree specifically, and a high school diploma. We could look at other ones, including an associate degree or a certificate, but we're going to keep it simple. And again, I want to be very clear that we're focusing on earnings, even though we know other margins matter. I'm going to kind of return to that at the end. And so why does this question matter? Well, it's probably not surprising that the effects of education can affect earnings, levels of earnings. But we might think that at least, that the proportional gains are actually relatively similar. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are growing up. You might get a 50% or 100% bump. You're going to start at different levels, but we would think that that proportional increase might be in the same ballpark. But it may not be. There's this difference between the additional number of dollars more versus the percentage more, and there are reasons for why that could matter. So if we think that college and your social background are complements, they actually stack on top of each other, or that the more students lately who have been completing college face additional workforce barriers for whatever circumstances, then it's possible that the proportional returns could actually be lower for the low-income folks. On the other hand, if college and social background are substitutes, so one is actually making up for the other, or we think that college reduces the workforce barriers that otherwise might exist for individuals, then it could be that the returns are actually higher for low-income folks. So we don't know offhand. It could go either way. We really need to take data to answer the question. How do we answer the question? Well, we need to find the right data source, and you need to be able to track people across multiple generations, because you need to observe people when they're adolescents, when they're children, to know what their family income is, and then follow them into adulthood so you can actually see their own earnings. And it turns out there are not that many data sources that allow you to do this, unless you're someone like Raj Chetty and you manage to get the complete history of tax data. We are not. So we use an alternative data source called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, which is the longest running longitudinal household survey in the world. It's been continuously surveying families and their descendants, even if they leave and form new households, for the last 54 years, which is a very long time. It really allows us to begin to answer this question. And again, the real benefit of it is that we can follow people's family income when they're adolescents and follow the children at the time as they become adults and earn more money then. There are some caveats. It was based in 1968, and so it was a snapshot of what America looked like in 1968. And so it's going to underrepresent a lot of demographic changes that have happened over the last 50 years, particularly the growth of Hispanics and Latinx and Asian populations. They've tried to refresh the sample, but it doesn't go all the way back, so we can't really use it. So again, we're going to be focusing on the panel as it exists, but I will talk about how situations and circumstances are different for Blacks and whites. And one other caveat, relatively minor one, we don't observe respondents if they're still living with their parents. We don't see their earnings. They have to form new households, but over their lifetime, most of them do that. So how do we measure family income growing up? We basically try to look at the income in the household when a person is aged 13 through 17, so when they're teenagers. We basically can observe their family income, but we're going to transform it. We transform it by dividing by the federal poverty line, the federal poverty threshold at that year based on their family structure. So everything is in terms of a ratio of the poverty line. And then we classify individuals into two groups. They're either low income if their family income is below 1.85 times the federal poverty line, and they're higher income or not low income if they're above that. Why do we use this ratio 1.85, which seems arbitrary? Well, those of you who are familiar with elementary or even secondary education know that that threshold corresponds to the eligibility for the assisted lunch program. It's one of the few measures of socioeconomic status that is observed about people when they're in school. And so we viewed that as a pretty good cutoff, but we're going to look at other cutoffs as well. So how do we measure educational attainment, which is the other aspect of it, because we need to divide people on the basis of whether they have a bachelor's degree or not. We're going to focus on whether the people have an exact high school graduate. So no college attended, they only have a high school diploma. And we're also not including people who get, say, a GED. And then we're going to also look at people who have bachelor's degrees. Again, here, not exactly, but we're going to allow people to have graduate degrees too. And that's going to turn out to be an important part of the story. So the timing also matters. We're going to allow people to get to age 25 before they have to have a bachelor's degree. We certainly acknowledge that many people are going to get bachelor's degrees beyond that, but this is also part of the dynamic story. So both graduate degrees that people may get later in life is an important option. Maybe that's related to the basis of if you grow up in a higher income versus a lower income household. But also if you're a high school graduate and you go on and attend college and get your BA after age 25, you'll be counted as a high school graduate, but you'll have some earnings once you have a bachelor's degree, and that would tend to shrink the earnings gap. So that's also part of the story. We want to actually account for that. And so when we get right to it, this is basically what it looks like when we actually look at career earnings profiles for these adolescents based on whether they grow up here. In a low-income household, there are two series. One in the red is if they graduate from college, they have a bachelor's degree. The one in blue is actually showing if they have just a high school diploma. And you can see we also have we have adjusted for inflation. So all of these are in same dollar values. And then the whiskers are actually showing confidence intervals, so you can see whether they're statistically different or not. And from the graph, you can see there's definitely a college earnings premium. Right from the mid-20s, people with a college degree, a bachelor's degree, even if they grew up low income, are earning more money than people who only have a high school diploma. And you can see that the earnings premium peaks around the mid-40s, but then it actually starts declining, the college premium, the difference between what college graduates and high school graduates earn, such that by the late 50s, it's actually possibly turning negative. So that's important to know. Now I'm going to show you the high income picture. It's on the same scale, but immediately it should be apparent that the college graduate line is much higher than it was before. And it actually peaks closer to 50 rather than mid 40s, and it stays significantly above the high school graduate line for the entire time period through the early 60s. There is also a return to coming from a high income family background. Even if you have only a high school graduate education, it's a little bit harder to see on the graph, but the blue line in this graph is higher than the blue line in the previous graph. But the big thing to notice is that the slope, that the direction of that red line is steeper for the high income folks than it is for the lower income folks. In fact, for each additional year, for college graduates, for high income family backgrounds, they're earning roughly $2,600 more a year. For the low income folks, the college graduates are only earning about $1,200 more a year. So even in levels, it makes a pretty big difference right off the bat. But another way to think about this is that the average low income college grad earns about as much at career peak as the average higher income college grad earns at career start. It really is that dramatic. But how do we take all of these numbers and put it into something a little bit more digestible? Well, we can actually add them all up across the lifetime and then do some discounting so that it's all in terms of the dollars that, say, a high school graduate is facing. We're actually downweighting some of the earnings later in life because in theory, you could invest some of that money earlier on, and we want to make that comparable. So if we actually do that and use these discounted totals, these are the sums of how much money people are making in today's dollars. And you can see that for a high school graduate from a low income background, it's about $563,000. For a college graduate, it jumps up to $960,000. But if you're coming from a higher income family background, high school graduates earn about $785,000. The college graduates earn more than twice as much, over $1.8 million. So we can just look at those differences within each educational family background, or within each family income background, and say that for low-income folks, the college graduates are earning about $400,000 more over their lifetimes. But for the higher income folks, it's over $1 million more. And so if we actually take the difference between those two differences, we find out that the premium in levels for coming from a higher income background is $672,000 more. The college premium for high income folks is $672,000 higher than it is for low income folks. But what about if we want to go back to turning it into the percentage increases, those proportions or ratios? We can do that too. And it turns out that for college graduates from low-income family backgrounds, there's a 71% premium to college, but for the higher income folks, it's 136%. That's almost twice as much proportionally. That's huge. So like, what is going on is the big question. And another way to think about that is that if the low income folks had the same proportional return to college as the higher income folks did, they would earn $370,000 more, almost 40% over their careers. So that's a lot of money. So we really want to figure out what's actually driving this result. So how do we interpret this? We actually don't see this size gap in proportional returns on the basis of race or gender. For example, Blacks actually have a bigger return to college than whites do, 162% versus 137%. Men do see a bigger return to college than women, 173% to 119%. And I'll come back to that. That's also going to be an interesting part of the story. But in terms of being nearly twice as much, we don't see that along these racial or gender lines. So again, what's going on? So we really tried to delve deep and figure out across different groups what might be happening. And so here's the same picture again. Again, comparing the gap between higher income and lower income across different groups. I've scaled things a little bit in terms of log points, but we can think of that roughly still as percentage changes. And so the baseline is again capturing those numbers that I just showed you, where the fact that the red bar is bigger than the blue bar all the way at the left is indicating that higher income folks have a bigger college premium. The red bar being for higher income folks, their college premium, the blue bar being for lower income folks. And then each of the next bars are where we focus on specific demographic groups. And so you can see that for men, that gap is even bigger. For whites, it's bigger still. But for women and for Blacks, it's basically nil. The college premium is the same for women and Blacks, whether you grow up low income or not, but there's a huge gains to coming from a higher income household family if you are a man or you're a white person. And so that's just emphasizing what I just said. We can do it another way as well, specifically varying the threshold of family income background. So before we were using 185% of the FPL. Now these 4 bars on the right are actually showing what the college premium is for each of those income groups. And so you can see if we look at people above 400% of the federal poverty line, these are people who are doing relatively well growing up, it's about the same. That's really picking up a lot of the college premium because most of the people who actually go to college, a large number of them are above 400% of the federal poverty line. But as you go to the right, you can actually see this interesting U-shaped pattern where it actually begins falling, the college premium, as your income drops. But as you get to the very low end, below the federal poverty line itself, you can see that that return to college actually increases a lot. It's the biggest of the group. What's going on there? It turns out that the college premium is actually quite large for people below the poverty line, not because they're making so much money when they go to college, but because if they don't go to college and have only a high school diploma, their earnings are actually that low. So it's just a low base. So proportionally, the return is really big. On the other hand, for people who are near poverty, the premium is actually quite low. This is because college seems to be adding relatively little to their earnings. They're actually doing reasonably well for high school. College is not adding nearly as much, at least relative to if you grew up in a higher income household. So there are a few other things that we do to try to figure out what's going on. We can say, rather than looking at earnings based on age 25 plus, what happens if you look at age 20 plus? Doesn't really change the pattern that we found from the baseline. We could drop the people who have zero earnings. In other words, don't include people who aren't working in any given year and only focus on workers. That also actually increases the gap a little bit. So that's not making a big difference. But then we can do a few other things. I mentioned earlier that graduate degrees could be a part of the story. They are. If we throw out people when we're calculating the earnings returns who ever end up getting graduate degrees or periods once they get graduate degrees, you can see that that gap basically disappears. So the graduate degrees, the option for people who get a bachelor's degree and have higher income, that seems to be a big part of the story. Similarly, if we exclude people who are in the very top of the earnings distribution, the top 1%, for example, that gap shrinks quite a lot. If we look at the median earnings rather than the average earnings, which is what we've been doing, and average earnings are not the same as median because some people earn a very large amount of money, and those are included in the average, but they're not included at the median. There's actually, the gap actually reverses in the median. There's actually a slightly larger, though it's not statistically significant, return to college at the median for low-income folks rather than higher income folks. But as you move up into the 90th percentile, you really see that gap emerge. In fact, another way of looking at that is to say, what is the college earnings premium, the differential college earnings premium based on whether you grew up higher income or a lower income family over the entire earnings distribution. This picture is only for people who are working, but that thick blue line, the closer it is to zero on the left axis, that's saying that the returns to college are basically the same whether you grow up high income or low income. And it's pretty close to zero, and it's slowly increasing as you move all the way up, but it really starts taking off in the top quarter of the earnings distribution. So it's the very high earners that seem to be driving this pattern. So how do we actually put all of this together? What does it mean? Well, it suggests that there's a glass ceiling that's class-based, that if you grow up low income, you seem to be unable, or at least less likely, to actually access the top part of the earnings distribution, those very high earning paid jobs, very high earning paid professionals, managers, executives, things like that. The likelihood of getting to those types of jobs, even if you get a college degree, are just much less if you grow up low income. Why might that be? There are many likely mechanisms. We've thought of a bunch. I'm sure you're thinking of a bunch right now too, but just going in reverse order on the basis of where we observe people in the work world back to their adolescence. It could be the number of hours they work, their occupation, the type of employer that they have, their social networks, the field of study that they did in undergraduate and possibly graduate school, what institutions they attended, pre-college factors, many social factors, many barriers from racism, as well as classism that people may have faced growing up, all of it is in there, it likely all matters, but we really need more research that's trying to carefully figure out how all of those pieces fit together, because it's going to matter in terms of what we should do in terms of policy. Because what our results are basically showing is that education is not going to be enough to promote economic mobility and reduce inequality by itself. We're going to need carefully tailored policies that actually apply to the specific barriers that people face if we want to move the needle on these things, with the caveat that, again, we've only looked at earnings. So this glass ceiling definitely applies to earnings, but we don't know. We just don't know at this point whether it also applies to other outcomes for which education has shown to matter, particularly for health. It could actually even be the case that it's the reverse. There's like kind of a glass floor, that higher education actually has bigger impacts for if you grew up lower income in terms of your health behaviors. We know, for example, that if you grow up in a lower income household, you're more likely to have obesity or diabetes issues, you're more likely to smoke, you're more likely to engage in other risky behaviors. So the fact that education might be able to reduce them more might actually attenuate the effect we see in earnings. We're essentially trading off health impacts for earnings impacts. But again, the mechanisms that we need to understand better will be crucial for designing better policy responses. So thank you very much for your time. I am unavailable, unfortunately, today to take questions, but I am happy to do follow-up. I'm sure the organizers will share my email information and contact information. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I look forward to your questions and comments, and thanks again.
I have to say that that is one fascinating study that Dr. Hershbein has presented for us. And we are going to hold questions to the very end after Ashley has an opportunity to share her presentation. But just thinking about the intersections between family income and education attainment and the implications for policy really sets us up nicely for your presentation, Ashley. So we look forward to hearing from you, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I'm so glad to be with you all this afternoon, and I'm going to do the share screen part. Let's see how that goes. Let's see. Okay. All right. Well, Brad did a really great job framing out the connections between education and health, and income and education and health. And so the piece that I'm going to provide is to talk about the economic and racial inequities of college affordability and student debt. And I will point to some policy solutions toward the end of the presentation. Like I said, Brad did a great job framing things out, and I'm just going to provide a little orienting slide because most of my presentation is about college affordability. So I want to make sure I connect that to health. And we did a report at the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy. We did a report a few years ago, and a lot of our work is on budget, the state budget. And we did a piece that looked at the implications of the investments in the state budget related to health outcomes. And so just the general framing here is from that report that, you know, a large share of health outcomes are based on social and economic conditions. And I will be talking, one policy that I will describe has to do with the state budget and investments in public higher education. And so I just have a little quote here from that report that these investments that we make as a state do have important health implications. So college affordability in Kentucky. We're not doing very well. There's a report from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a national think tank, that came out in 2021, and it ranked Kentucky 6th worst in terms of college affordability. And the way that they measured it was to look at the average published tuition at public four-year universities in Kentucky, and to look at that in relation to median income. And so the report showed that the cost of college has risen quickly, and affordability is particularly challenging for Kentuckians with low incomes and Kentuckians of color, and that makes it difficult to complete a post-secondary degree. The average published tuition at public four-year universities in Kentucky grew by 33.5% between 2008 and 2019, and that is in inflation-adjusted terms. And we know that community colleges are really the most affordable option, and yet tuition at Kentucky community colleges increased by 28.5%. So looking at the issue with median income, median household income for Kentuckians has remained relatively stagnant for 2 decades. So college costs are going up and median incomes are not. And that's what this little map and the little snippet on Kentucky from the report shows here on the slide, that that on average, in Kentucky, the cost of college is 30% of median household income, and disaggregating by race shows that the cost is a greater barrier for Kentuckians of color. Kentucky was one of 17 states where Black households would need to spend at least 40% of their incomes to get a degree. And you can see the breakdown by race here on the slide. I'm going to talk about a couple of troubling trends related to increases in college costs. One of them is one of the factors that has been driving up tuition and fees in our state and in many other states as well, I should mention. There's been a decline in state funding since the before the Great Recession. So that's why we mark a lot of things in terms of 2008, that the state was investing at a certain level in 2008. And if we look at what happened since then, there's been a decline. Although you can see in the graph, there's been a little more increase recently, but I want to say a bit more about that. So you can see that this is in inflation adjusted terms. You can see that there's this decline from 2008, and then it starts to go up a little bit, but it nowhere compares to 2008 levels, which weren't necessarily adequate in 2008 actually. So the state funding level in 2024, and that's in the state budget that was passed earlier this year, is still 26% lower than in 2008 in inflation adjusted terms. So it's going up a bit, but it still doesn't even compare to 2008. And you'll notice the light blue in that bar graph is performance funding. And this is state funding that's distributed among the public institutions based on a formula where there are metrics like how many students attain degrees and just different other metrics. And we've written about it and it's on our website. But really something most important to know is that the way that funding is distributed, it typically doesn't go to several of our public universities. And those are the ones that are smaller universities and that serve more low-income students and in some cases students of color. So like Moorhead and Kentucky State haven't been getting performance funding based on that formula. So it's going up some, but we have to keep that in mind. And then I want to draw attention to the line graph there, and that just shows the total cost of higher education in public dollars. So the state share is the state investment, the general fund, and that's been going way down before 2008, right? Just going down. And then the student share, that's revenue from tuition and fees, that has been going up. And that is a very concerning chart. And that's where we can see that relationship, when state funding declined, that universities and community colleges tried to raise some of the money that they were losing through tuition and fees. But even then, there were that didn't make up the full difference. So another trend related to college affordability that is very well known at this point and getting a lot of attention right now is that the increase in student loans, the prevalence of them, and also the median amounts. It's truly a crisis nationally, including in Kentucky. And I'll be talking more about, after I set the national context, I'll be talking about Kentucky specifically. So 45 million borrowers in the US hold roughly $1.7 trillion in federal student loan debt. The majority are women. Black borrowers have higher average levels of debt and default and have a harder time paying down balances over time related to systemic inequities, including discrimination in the labor market. And then prior to the pandemic, when student loan payments have been paused, there were high rates of default as well. And this trend toward student debt is often considered to be it provided opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't have gone to college, people who might not otherwise have the financial means. And so it was considered to be, by a lot of people, to be a move to create greater equity in education. And yet, as I'll be discussing, it's actually increased inequality in a lot of ways. So I want to talk about the racial wealth gap. And in the next few slides, I'm drawing on the work of sociologist Dr. Louise Seamster at the University of Iowa. And she's a top expert in the field of student debt and race equity, and has published a lot on it. And she did a presentation that framed things out in a really helpful way. I thought, so I'm going to draw on her work in the framing, and then I'll specifically cite her work as well. But when you see this graph, our eyes I see a lot of things. I see, oh wow, in 1983, white families held 8 times more wealth than black families, and that's really the same thing in 2019. I see that. But what she points out in this graph, and this is a graph from the Urban Institute, half of all Black wealth was lost in 5 years following the Great Recession. So that's a part that we can look at, that pink line, and looking at it says 07, and then looking at that drop. And so what caused that drop in Black wealth? And sure, the foreclosure crisis was a big part of it, and that might be coming to a lot of folks' minds. But the scholars who are researching this have shown that education debt is an unusually large driver of this. And so again, at the same time, there's been a big focus on higher education as a way to address racial inequities, and that student debt was viewed as a solution to get more people to be able to go to college. It's actually been contributing significantly to the widening of the racial wealth gap. And that's the case because those who go on to college on average do earn more, but it isn't enough to address that gap, and it masks differences in outcomes, some of the differences that Brad's presentation described. And I am trying to forward my slide. So this next graph is from a really important report called Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain by experts on race, the racial wealth gap, Dr. Derek Hamilton and Dr. Sandy Darity and their colleagues. And this shows wealth and education by education and race. And there's a lot of similarities here to what Brad was presenting, where you can see that it's really due largely to discrimination in the labor market, as well as other historic inequities. But you can see that higher educational attainment doesn't pay off as much for Black people with the same educational attainment as it does for white people. And Dr. Louise Seamster talks about that it's really been a case of what she calls predatory inclusion, in terms of the way that student debt was treated as a way to attract more people to college, that it became more accessible for people, but it's been really harmful to people of color in particular, who are disadvantaged in paying down and paying off loans. So this, the graph that has the green and the red and the blue, that is from, actually it's from Dr. Seamster's Twitter feed, where she puts out a lot of really great information. It's not in the published paper at this time, and it was created by her scholar collaborator. And you can see there that with the black line, the red line, which indicates Black median debt for student borrower households, that really jumps up after, in there around 2015 or so. And then it just doesn't do this to the same extent with white borrower households. So that's looking at this disproportionality where the median debt is increasingly higher for Black borrowers. And then in the next figure, that's from a study from Brandeis University. And it shows that even when the median amounts are somewhat different between Black borrowers and white borrowers, that it's a lot of the inequity happens because the Black borrowers aren't able to pay the debt down over time. And so that is just to many of us, and for me, the first time seeing that, it's just so dramatic looking at how 20 years after starting college, the typical Black borrower still owes 95% of debt, compared to a white student. The typical white student owes just 6%. And that again has a lot to do with the labor market outcomes and discrimination in the labor market, where we see white students and Black students are working to pay down debt, but there are more challenges for these Black borrowers. There's another study I want to mention that shows that if you look, it's Judith Scott Clayton and Jing Lee, show that there's a Black-white disparity in student debt more than tripling 4 years after graduation. So that's another study that just shows the disparate impact on Black borrowers. Now, student debt cancellation can help to address these racial inequities. And many of you may have heard of some discussion of this in recent conversations about student debt. And so I want to mention that Dr. Seamster's research shows that at the national level, 73% of Black households would have their student debt entirely wiped out following a $50,000 student debt cancellation policy. And it would at $50,000 in cancellation, that would shrink the racial wealth gap from 20 to 1 favoring white borrowers to 3 to 1. And the impact on Black wealth more broadly is that it would, the $50,000 in cancellation would increase Black wealth by 1/3 for all households. So that is certainly one of the policies I'm going to be talking about, student debt cancellation. But I wanted to describe that impact in talking nationally here about the racial inequities. Before moving to talk about Kentucky, what's happening in Kentucky? Well, like the rest of the country, we have a student debt crisis in Kentucky. You can see that when we put out our report on this, that looked at principal and interest balances as of September 30th of 2020, you can see there was $20.5 billion in student debt, federal student debt, owed by Kentuckians. The average balance, a little over $30,000. And then looking at just a little bit of the breakdown, You can see that some of these amounts are relatively small, but for the people trying to pay down their debt, it doesn't feel small at all, and it can be really challenging, for individuals to pay down the debt. They make payments, but it can be really challenging to pay down the debt, in part because of interest accruing at a pretty high rate. So the previous, actually, I want to go back here for a minute. This data doesn't show the breakdown by race. We do have it in our report, broken out by age, and but we don't have it broken out by race. It's not available to us. So what we did is to look at a sample of public higher education students, and we looked at 223,557 students, and they met the following criteria: that they started college in 2012 or later, they were not enrolled during 2019, they either left or graduated, they worked in Kentucky during 2019 and 2020, and they didn't go to private college at all. So that's who we're looking at here. And what we found is more than half received federal loans, that Black students were more likely to have student debt, although in this sample, it was not higher median amounts. A large share of those with student loans did not earn a degree or credential. They left and did not earn a degree or credential and still had debt. Over half of the former, over half of the former students had, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, had 2020 incomes under $30,000. So it's very hard for them to pay down their debt. And only 4.6% had incomes over 75,000. And then disaggregating by race, a higher percentage of Black students who received federal student loans earned less than 30,000 than any other race or ethnic group. And only 10.6% of Black former students who received student loan aid earned more than 48,000 in 2020. So this does give some idea of what Kentucky students are dealing with. And we have a lot of students with debt who haven't completed a degree or credential, and they have relatively low incomes, and it's very challenging for them to make progress on paying down their debt. And also, again, disaggregated by race, we see those racial inequities happening in Kentucky based on this sample. Now when I want to forward it, it won't. There we go. I want to just use this quote as a way to connect higher ed back to health. And we reached out to Kentuckians and asked them to share their student debt stories with us. And we heard from more than 70 folks, and some of them said we could share their stories. And this quote here from that project really speaks to a lot of these issues. Stephanie in Garrett County says she currently owes over $100,000. It's been crippling debt her entire adult life, and she won't pay it off before she dies. She talks about raising children as a single parent and trying to support her elderly parents, and that they're having trouble paying for medication, and that she was trying to earn more money by taking out loans to get a master's degree, to be a teacher, but it's causing her just so much stress, and student debt cancellation would mean so much to her. So we do have this a bright spot in this story, where President Biden has announced, as you all know, student debt cancellation action, which is a really good first step. It's up to $10,000 of student debt for borrowers with federal loans, as long as people have income below $125,000 a year. And then there's an additional $10,000 for a total of up to $20,000 in cancellation for those who received a need-based federal Pell Grant while attending college. And then there were some other measures done related to income-driven repayment that would really help folks as well. So the White House estimates that 563,300 Kentuckians are eligible for that debt relief, with 394,000 of them having received a Pell Grant, so eligible for that $20,000. And if anyone else was on Twitter Friday night, isn't that how many of us spend our Friday nights? A lot of good information on Twitter. It was really exciting when a beta version of the cancellation application went live this weekend. So please spread the word. Folks do need to do a very simple application to be able to apply. There's just a small group of people that it will happen automatically. So make sure to spread the word. This is really exciting. And there are ways that we need to build on this first step, at the federal level, as I mentioned before, in terms of the race equity implications. Larger amounts of cancellation would make a bigger difference. So that could be built on at the federal level. We also need to invest in higher education through the state budget. And we do have funds to be able to do so. And we, as a state, our legislators shouldn't jeopardize the funds that we do have to do that by making decisions about tax cuts that are very short-sighted. And there are bigger, broader policies that intersect with education policy. We need to improve wages and job quality and economic supports for Kentuckians as well, as part of policies that would really improve educational attainment and would improve economic outcomes and health equity as well. And I do see that I am out of time, so I will stop sharing now.
Ashley, thank you so much for such an eye-opening and intriguing report. Quite a bit of information that you've compiled in your presentation that really seemed to overlap nicely with the previous panelist presentation. I think at this time, we'd like to use the next few minutes that we have for any questions that may come in from the audience. So are there questions that need to be included or asked of the audience? I don't necessarily see any.
Not necessarily
in, Ashley, it's because your presentation was so thorough, and it's difficult for us to get Brad's questions answered directly, but we have placed in the chat Brad's email information if anyone would like to submit questions to him. Okay, so we have one question that came in, Ashley. Regarding student loans, it seems like debt cancellation is great for people with existing debt. What do you propose for future students?
That is a great question. And as I mentioned, the actions that President Biden has taken on student debt will have implications for future borrowers in terms of the income-driven repayment plan and the ways that it makes those payments much more affordable. So that's really important. At the same time, though, we need for tuition and fees in recent years, they haven't been going up very much. Just in these past few years, when we see it go up, it's really going up. Not a lot, but we have a lot of ground to make up for after all these years of it spiking. And universities and community colleges are sometimes making sacrifices there in order to keep from increasing tuition. And so we need a lot of state investment. We certainly don't want to go backward, and we need more state investment. And that can be in terms of state scholarships as well. And there's a movement, you all know, for free college, free community college especially. And we have a scholarship in Kentucky that is limited in terms of its ability to do that. But for largely community college students, for 2 years, and for certain types of degrees, the Work Ready Scholarship in Kentucky. But we could build on that, and we could provide more opportunities. And tuition and fees aren't the only costs of college, and so it's important too that we pay attention to our scholarships abilities to really support students who need help being successful in college. Our students are working a lot. They need childcare. They need supports, and so so that's important to look at as well when we look at scholarships and the needed investments that our state can make. And then also the changes at the federal level are very positive, and they will help people who haven't even yet taken out loans, as well as people who already do. And the federal government should absolutely build on these first steps.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. We have a couple more questions that have come in. Thank you to the audience for submitting these questions. The second question is, as folks become increasingly aware that education is not doing much to close the wealth gap, are you hearing more discussion about universal basic income as a possible solution?
That is certainly a policy proposal that that is very interesting, and there's some support for it. I don't hear it being discussed as a policy that will be happening in the near future, but I think that thank you for raising it, and it certainly is a policy idea that would address some of these issues. Thanks.
Okay, super. Another question, how should we be advocating for increase in minimum wage to pay folks what they are worth?
Thank you for that question. And when I was quickly going through the policies, I was like, and we need other policies as well. Absolutely. We need to raise the state minimum wage, and most states already have raised it above the federal level. Can you believe? And some of folks on here may be working these jobs now, but that the tipped minimum wage hasn't gone up in a really long time. It's still $2.13 an hour, and so we absolutely, as a state, need to increase the minimum wage, including the tipped minimum wage.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Ashley, another question. I think we have time for maybe two or three more. If your question does not get answered, we'll make sure that Ashley and Brad both get the questions so that we can get responses to these. Do you see any reasonable chance of the state increasing funding for higher education?
I believe a reasonable chance, yes. Is it likely that it will happen? I don't know. Our state passes a state budget every 2 years, except during the pandemic, it was actually only 1-year budgets were passed because the revenue situation was so uncertain. But really, we're looking at the 2024 legislative session as the next opportunity for the state budget to create those investments. And as you saw in the graph, there was some increase in state higher ed funding, and so we saw that happen. Now, a lot of it was that performance funding, so we need to do more. It's still not even up, not even close to being up to 2008 levels like you all saw. But the real reason that I want to emphasize that we do have an opportunity is that legislators are making a choice. We currently do have revenue to invest in these critical areas like higher education. As a state, we do have revenue to do it. And what we're going to see happen next session is legislators are going to vote on whether to move forward with an income tax cut based on a bill that was passed, House Bill 8. And the more that we jeopardize our revenue with more tax cuts, and especially those that disproportionately advantage wealthy people already, that is going to jeopardize our ability to make these important investments. So in the 2023 legislative session, we should all pay attention to the choices our legislators are going to make. And if they make decisions that lead to less revenue, then that has implications for our ability to invest in higher education.
Yes, yes, well said, Ashley. And we do need to pay close attention to the choices that are being made in order to have a healthier Kentucky. A couple more questions here. How do we message state funding for secondary education funding are investing in the Kentucky workforce? How do we message state funding for secondary education funding and investing for Kentucky workforce? I believe that's how that question came in.
I see that. I'm not quite sure the question, but certainly I'll just say that investments in higher education are an investment in our state's economy. Yes. And so these investments are important. And in terms of messaging, I appreciate the question because it's reminding me that that's a very helpful message. These are investments in health. These are investments in our economy, in our communities. So I appreciate the question. I may have not quite, I'm not sure if I fully answered it, but it made me recall some really important messaging. So thank you.
Yes, excellent, excellent. Let me get one more question in before we go and close out this panel. This has been very intriguing. Do you see the same discrepancies in trade school tuition debt and earning as college?
I haven't recently looked at breakdowns on that, but I do want to say that that community college student debt is a really big problem. And a lot of it, a lot of students, when they go to community college, they're more likely to have Pell, but the costs of college are really, really high, and they include housing and childcare costs. And we know students are already working, and there's research being shown that that even community college students are housing and food insecure, our college students. And so these economic security concerns apply to four-year institutions as well as community colleges, and then debt loads at for-profit kinds of trade schools. Those actually tend to be very high, and the default rates are very high there. And so that's something else that's really concerning to look at. So thank you for that question.
So thank you, Ashley. I know we had one question that came in about accessing the presentations, and hopefully we have your permission and Brad's permission.
Absolutely.
To put this on the foundation's website. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. Ashley and Brad have brought some amazing information to us. And after the break, I want to encourage everyone to come back for the final panel today. So thank you, Ashley, for such an enlightening presentation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.